What would make a prince accuse his own wife of emotional abuse in a court of law? Not a tabloid interview, not a leaked audio clip, not a carefully worded memoir passage. A court document. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's what made jaws drop just moments ago, when reports surfaced that Prince Harry has formally filed for divorce and is seeking sole custody of his children, citing emotional abuse as part of his legal argument. Not whispered, not implied, written down, signed, submitted. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This wasn't emotional. It was strategic. For years, the public story has been simple. A wounded prince finds love, flees the institution that hurt him, and builds a new life across the ocean. Against the press. Against the palace. Against tradition. That narrative was repeated so often it became fact in many people's minds. But today, that story cracked. Because people don't use the words emotional abuse lightly in family court. Those words aren't written for sympathy. They're written for judges, for custody evaluators, for long-term consequences that don't fade with headlines. So the real question isn't, did Harry file for divorce? The real question is, why now? Why not months ago? Why not quietly? Why not a standard filing with shared custody like most high-profile couples choose? Instead, this filing landed like a grenade. Sudden, specific, and aimed directly at the most sensitive issue of all, the children. If you've ever followed celebrity divorces, you know the rule. Money is negotiated, property is divided, public statements are polished. But custody is usually handled carefully, almost delicately, especially when both parents want to protect their image. Which makes this move feel different, because seeking sole custody is not defensive. It's aggressive. It suggests one of two things. Either Harry believes something is so damaging that shared custody is impossible, or he believes the court can be convinced that it is. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Think about it. Alleging emotional abuse doesn't just describe a relationship. It reframes it. It takes private arguments, power dynamics, and moments of tension and turns them into potential legal evidence. Suddenly, what looked like a troubled marriage becomes something much darker on paper. And there's another layer here that hasn't gotten enough attention. This filing doesn't just challenge a spouse. It challenges a narrative Harry himself helped build. The loyal husband, the protector, the man who stood beside his wife against the world. So what changed? Did something happen behind closed doors that finally crossed a line? Or has something been building for years, quietly, carefully waiting for the right moment to surface? Because timing like this is never accidental. Family court doesn't reward emotion. Patterns. Language chosen with surgical precision. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. That this wasn't a breaking point. It was a planned one. And if that's true, then today isn't the beginning of the story. It's the reveal. As for Meghan Markle, she hasn't publicly responded yet, but silence in moments like this is rarely calm. It's calculated, because every word spoken outside the courtroom can echo inside it. And that's what makes this moment so unsettling. Two people who once claimed they were fighting the same enemies now appear to be preparing for the same judge. But before we look at what Harry is actually accusing her of and why sole custody is the centerpiece of this legal bombshell, there's something you need to understand first. This filing wasn't about ending a marriage. It was about changing who holds power when it's over. This wasn't heartbreak. This was a legal strike. That's the first thing lawyers tend to notice when they look at filings like this. Because when someone files for divorce quietly, the paperwork is usually clean, neutral, almost boring. Dates, assets, parenting schedules, carefully balanced language designed to calm things down. This wasn't that. This filing arrived with weight behind it. The kind of weight that suggests preparation. Because buried inside the formal language was a phrase that instantly raised eyebrows in legal circles and set social media on fire. Emotional abuse, not incompatibility. Not irreconcilable differences, not the marriage has broken down. Emotional abuse. That phrase alone changes the entire posture of a divorce case. It reframes everything that came before it. And when it's used by someone like Prince Harry, it sends a message that's impossible to ignore. Here's why. Family courts don't treat emotional abuse as gossip. They treat it as a potential pattern, a behavior, something that can affect children, parenting capacity, and custody outcomes. Which means that once those words are written down, the court isn't just dissolving a marriage, it's being asked to evaluate a household. And that's where things get uncomfortable, because filings like this aren't written in the heat of the moment. They're drafted slowly, line by line, often reviewed multiple times, every word chosen for what it implies, not just what it says. Especially in high-profile cases where every sentence might one day be read aloud in a courtroom. So ask yourself this: would someone include an allegation that's serious unless they believed it could be defended, or unless they believed the risk of not including it was greater? That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. For years, Harry publicly defended his wife with intensity. He framed himself as the shield, the one absorbing the blows, the one standing between her and a hostile world. Interviews, statements, even legal actions against the press reinforce that image. Now, suddenly, the language has flipped. The protector is now the petitioner. The defender is now the accuser. And that reversal didn't happen by accident. Sources familiar with family court strategy often point out something the public rarely considers. Allegations and filings are often designed not just to tell a story, but to set boundaries, to draw lines early, to define the lens through which everything else will be viewed. Once emotional abuse is alleged, the court starts asking different questions. How did conflict present itself in the home? Who held emotional power? How did stress manifest around the children? And perhaps most importantly, who is the safer emotional environment going forward? That's why this filing felt less like a breakup announcement and more like a positioning move. And then there's the timing. Why now? Not after a public blow-up. Not after a leaked argument. Not after a scandal that forced a reaction. This arrived quietly, then exploded outward, which suggests the pressure wasn't external. It was internal, strategic. Something reached a point where silence became a liability. And then there's the custody request, because alleging emotional abuse while also seeking sole custody isn't just a complaint, it's a narrative. One that implies the issues weren't limited to the marriage, but extended into the family structure itself. That implication is devastating if it sticks, and it puts Meghan Markle in an impossible position. Respond too emotionally, and it risks validating the claim. Stay silent too long, and the accusation hardens in public perception. This is how legal wars begin, not with shouting, with paperwork. But here's the part most people missed. The most aggressive language in this filing wasn't about what happened between Harry and Meghan. It was about what Harry believes could happen next if nothing changes. And that belief is the key to understanding why this case is about far more than divorce. Because once sole custody enters the picture, the fight stops being about the past. It becomes a battle over the future. And if that future hinges on how the court interprets these claims, then the next phase of this story is going to be far more intense than anyone is prepared for. Because what Harry is really asking for isn't separation, it's control over what happens after. And the moment the court considers that request, everything changes. This wasn't about ending a marriage. This was about deciding who gets to shape the children's world. That's the sentence family court veterans kept repeating as details of the filing began to circulate. Because divorce is common, even among public figures, custody fights like this are not. Sole custody is the nuclear option. It's not requested casually. It's not suggested lightly. And it's almost never pursued unless one parent believes the court can be persuaded that shared parenting isn't just difficult, but harmful. So when Prince Harry asked for it, the entire case shifted gears. Here's what most people don't realize. Family courts start from a presumption that children benefit from having both parents actively involved. To overcome that presumption, a petitioner has to do more than say the marriage was unhappy. They have to argue that something about the environment, the dynamics, or the emotional climate makes equal parenting unworkable. That's where the emotional abuse allegation suddenly takes on new meaning. Because in custody cases, emotional abuse isn't just about how a partner feels. It's about patterns, influence, the emotional temperature of a household, the way conflict is expressed when children are present, the way stress spills over into daily life. In other words, it's not about love. It's about control. And here's the irony that makes this moment so unsettling. For years, Harry positioned himself as the one escaping control, escaping the palace, escaping rigid systems, escaping expectations placed on him since birth. Now, critics are asking an uncomfortable question. Is this about protecting his children? Or about regaining control in a life that has felt increasingly chaotic? That question hangs over everything. Because seeking sole custody doesn't just determine where children live. It determines who makes decisions, schooling, healthcare, travel, media exposure. It decides whose values dominate day-to-day life. And when you frame it that way, the filing starts to look less like a reaction and more like a strategic pivot, especially when you consider what isn't being said publicly. There are no dramatic interviews, no emotional speeches, no social media pleas, just legal language, tight, controlled, almost clinical. That tells us something. This isn't being fought in the court of public opinion. At least not yet. It's being fought where evidence matters more than emotion, where impressions are built slowly through records, testimony, and expert evaluations. And make no mistake, custody battles like this often involve third parties, parenting assessments, psychological evaluations, detailed examinations of communication patterns, stress responses, conflict resolution styles. Every text, every email, every moment of tension can suddenly become relevant, which raises the stakes in a terrifying way. Because once the court starts asking who provides the more stable emotional environment, the narrative stops being about who suffered more. It becomes about who is safer. And that's a devastating question for any parent to face. For Meghan Markle, the implications are enormous. Responding defensively could escalate the situation. Staying silent could allow assumptions to calcify. Either way, the margin for error is razor thin. And then there's the public, because no matter how sealed the proceedings are, perceptions leak. Narratives form. Allegations, even unproven ones, take on a life of their own. That's why sole custody requests are so rare among high-profile couples. They create winners and losers in the public mind before a judge ever rules. So why risk it? That's the question no one can answer yet. Is Harry acting out of fear, out of conviction, or out of a belief that this is the only way to protect what matters most to him? Because if the court agrees to even consider limiting shared custody, it means the allegations have already crossed a critical threshold. And once that happens, there's no going back to a quiet separation. There's only escalation. This is where the story stops being about divorce papers and starts being about consequences. Because once the words emotional abuse and sole custody enter the legal record, there is no clean reset, no quiet uncoupling, no mutual statement about focusing on the children. The ground shifts permanently. Think back to the opening question. What would make a prince accuse his own wife of emotional abuse in a court of law? Now we have part of the answer: fear, control, or the belief that the truth, as he sees it, finally outweighs the cost of saying it out loud. For Prince Harry, this filing is a gamble, not just legally, but historically, because once you make allegations this serious, you don't get to walk them back without damage. If the court pushes back, if the claims fail to meet the threshold he's implying, the narrative flips again. From protector to aggressor, from concerned parent to overreaching one. And that's the risk most people aren't talking about. Family court doesn't care about symbolism. It cares about evidence, patterns, credibility, consistency. And those standards don't bend for titles or public sympathy. If anything, they become stricter. Which means Harry isn't just asking the court to believe him, he's asking it to scrutinize his entire life. Every public contradiction, every interview where he described his marriage in glowing terms. Because opposing counsel won't just argue against his claims, they'll argue against his consistency. And that's where this case becomes truly volatile. For Meghan Markle, the stakes are just as high, but in a different way. Allegations like these don't need to be proven in the court of public opinion to cause harm. They only need to exist. To linger, to be repeated with the word alleged, attached, which somehow never dulls the edge. Her response, when it comes, won't just be about denial or defense. It will be about reframing, about shifting the lens away from accusation and toward context, and doing that without appearing dismissive, angry, or retaliatory is one of the hardest balances to strike in any legal fight, especially when children are involved, and that's the part that makes this story so uncomfortable. Because underneath the headlines, beneath the strategy and the language and the positioning, there are two children whose lives are about to be examined by strangers, whose routines, environments, and emotional worlds may be reduced to reports and recommendations. This is what happens when private pain becomes public process. And here's the final irony. For years, both Harry and Meghan framed themselves as victims of systems that didn't protect them. Institutions that prioritized image over well-being, narratives imposed from the outside. Now, they are stepping into one of the most invasive systems that exists, the family court, a system that doesn't care about branding, or loyalty, or public narrative, only about what can be demonstrated, documented, and defended. So where does that leave us? at the edge of a story that is far from over, because this filing is just the opening move. Responses will come. Counterclaims may follow. Details may surface slowly, selectively, through legal channels that don't move at the speed of social media, but carry far more weight. And when that happens, the public will be forced to confront a reality it often avoids. That's sometimes. There is no clear hero, no clean villain, only damage, decisions, and consequences that ripple outward. The fairy tale is officially over. What replaces it will be far more complicated. And as this case moves forward, one thing is certain: the truth won't be decided by headlines, it will be decided behind closed doors, where stories are tested, not told. And when that decision finally comes, it won't just end a marriage.